Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Cass. I'm the director of the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies. Thank you to everyone for being here in the room with us this evening, as well as those who are joining us on Zoom. Established in 2016, the mission of the nonpartisan Menard Center for Constitutional Studies is to promote research, education, and community outreach on matters related to the U.S. Constitution and the Wisconsin Constitution. And we are able to bring you programming like what we have this evening due to a generous gift from the Menard family. In addition, at the center, we sponsor student scholarships, student faculty collaborative research, reading groups, symposia, student workshops, and a host of other events with a special focus on the First Amendment's freedom of expression. Thank you also to our co-sponsor this evening, the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who worked with colleagues across the state to advance the public good. The Thompson Center carries on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. And the Thompson Center furthers these goals by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, honoring exemplary public leaders with the Distinguished Public Leadership Award, and conducting other activities across the University of Wisconsin system. For information on any upcoming events from the Thompson Center, as well as grant opportunities and other work they do, you can visit their website. And for the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies, you can feel free to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for more information. Now, tonight's event, Speech is Powerful, a conversation with Megan Phelps-Roper. The title of that event here this evening, Speech is Powerful, actually comes from a line in a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Snyder versus Phelps. And the name of that case should sound familiar, given our featured speaker this evening. In that case, the Supreme Court stated the following: speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and inflict great pain. We cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. And I'm sure as we go along this evening, we will discuss more about that case. Now, to introduce Megan Phelps-Roper, I will turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Adam Coons, who is a faculty member in the political science department here at UW-Eau Claire. He himself holds a law degree from George Washington University, and after several years in private practice, he earned his PhD from the University of California, Davis, and has been teaching here at UW-Eau Claire since 2021. So, turn it over.
Thank you so much, Eric. This is a knockoff, nerdy version of Between Two Ferns. You still have a scruffy-looking, heavy-set guy to do it, and we have a wonderful guest with us tonight. Megan is a writer, a host, and producer with the Free Press. She was born and raised in the Westboro Baptist Church, as we're going to talk more about tonight. She left a life of religious extremism in 2012. She spent the past decade using her experiences to work with schools on anti-bullying campaigns, with law enforcement organizations investigating deradicalization, and with tech companies on the intersection of safety, free speech, and the value of dialogue across ideological divides. Her journey has been chronicled in The New Yorker, a trio of BBC documentaries, a TED Talk, and her memoir, Unfollow, which I highly recommend. If you have not read it, you should absolutely buy a copy today. Additionally, she has recently released a podcast called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, which we'll also talk about tonight. We are so excited to have you here tonight, Megan. This is a rare opportunity to talk about, I think, some really important issues about civil discourse and about changing minds. So we are privileged to have you here. I want to hit the main issue right out of the gates so that we can kind of use that as our anchor point for our conversation. You are, I think, a really rare example of someone who has changed her mind, who has left a life of certainty in your beliefs. You were at one point without any doubt in your mind about the way the world was supposed to work. Can you talk to us about that process of changing your mind?
Yes, but I think I want to start just by saying, like, I don't actually think that I'm that rare. I think people change their minds on things all the time. Like we have seen in the last 2 decades, like literally, 20 years ago, the Lawrence versus Texas case at the U.S. Supreme Court, that was, overturned the laws against same-sex sex. And like, that was just 20 years ago. Like it was just a few years ago, the, Supreme Court decision about same-sex marriage. Like we as a society have changed drastically in really important ways. But I do understand the point you're making. It is a pretty, it's a pretty drastic change to go from the way that I was at Westboro, which is complete certainty in my beliefs, to where I am now, which is a place of a lot more doubt and holding my positions a lot more loosely. But so growing up in the Westboro Baptist Church, I was surrounded by people who were loving and well-intentioned and well-educated. And I felt so lucky to grow up among this group of people who were, doing the most important thing in the world, like taking the word of God and sharing it with everyone else. And it gave me, gave my life this sense of purpose and meaning, and that certainty that we were doing the right thing. And just because of the way our life was, laid out, every single day we're going and standing on public sidewalks. And from the age of 5, I am, put in this position to have to learn and defend and articulate Westboro's doctrines to the rest of the world. And that, it's that process of, some people call it brainwashing. I think indoctrination is a good word for it. We were reading the Bible every single day, memorizing all of the verses to show why Westboro was right and everybody else was wrong. So that the way that ideology completely shaped my understanding of the world and how it worked, it was total. And when I got on Twitter in 2009, I was in my early 20s and very much a zealous believer in Westboro's doctrines. I thought, okay, well, this is just another avenue that I have to go and lay out these doctrines to people because I thought that this, my grandfather used to say that, the world needs these words more than they need air to breathe, water to drink, or food to eat. Like this is how essential our message was for the world. So that was my goal. And what happened instead was that I absolutely got a lot of attention, and a lot of hate was reflected back at me. But I was used to that. So that didn't do anything. That was just the norm. What was new was that it let people understand and see me as a human being, and to recognize that even though I was saying these things that were, that they believed were extreme and destructive, they recognized that I was coming at it with good intentions. And in their willingness to engage with me over time, there was an outlet where there were many things about Twitter. Almost all of it happened on Twitter. There were many things about it that were different. So first, again, the fact that I could develop a rapport with people over time. When you're standing out on a picket line, you're out there for maybe a few hours at the most. And it's very hard, in this kind of, everybody's shouting their talking points and their anger and that is happening on Twitter, but it's also happening where people are like asking, questions, and they want to know. I felt safe engaging in a way that I didn't in real life. Because I went to public school, but I always knew to keep people at arm's length. And on Twitter, I felt like safe getting close to them in a way that I never would have in real life. So there was the rapport, there was the distance that actually gave it a level of intimacy that was not possible for me in real life. And then again, there was the willingness of these relatively few individuals who took the time and had the patience to ask questions and to really dig into what I was saying and where I was coming from. And in asking those questions, they were able to find these internal inconsistencies in Westboro's doctrines. And this might sound stupid, but having spent my whole life learning those doctrines and defending them against all comers, I just had that all that time, like the sense that like it was all evidence to me, like God is with us. Like clearly there's an answer for everything until there wasn't. And it was this moment of like some of those early contradictions, like they're like quite small points of doctrine, but what it introduced was the realization that we are human, we are fallible, our judgment is not unquestionable. And then ultimately what happens is like I start to question more and more of Westboro's doctrines over time. And it's like, and I mentioned this earlier, it's like a house of cards, because once I recognized that I could question all of these other questions and doubts that had, that had come up earlier in small ways and that had caused me to think like, essentially to just assume that there was a problem with me. If I don't understand this, or if I disagree with this, then this is evidence that there's something wrong with me. This is God testing me. This is Satan whispering in my ear.
Sure.
So Twitter became this place to explore ideas and to meet people and to really understand them in ways that I just never could in real life. I mean, and it's things like, sharing movies and like, I'm seeing aspects of people's lives that I didn't really ever see before. I'm literally like watching their children grow older in the photos they're posting. And again, there's just kind of there's something strange about social media. It's kind of this false sense of intimacy. And it was really powerful.
You mentioned something a second ago about how you had pushback your whole life, and you had done the picketing, you'd been out there doing the protests, and you had plenty of vitriol directed your direction. But you seem to be suggesting that really didn't have that much of an impact. That didn't change you. It was more of the intimate conversations. Why do you think the vitriolic attacking, the active resistance didn't really do that for you?
I think it's a few things. So first of all, it is part of the doctrine. There's passages in the Bible, and Jesus says, "Blessed are you when men will hate you and revile you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake." Blessed are you, right? When the world hates you. So it was
self-fulfilling in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it was confirmation. The fact that the world hated us. My grandfather, who's the pastor of the church, would say, we wear this like a badge of honor. And I didn't realize this at the time, but this is actually something, so we talked about this earlier too,
Sure.
There's shame, right? So I talked to an anthropologist after I left, and she defined shame as the feeling that you get when you know that you have violated the norms of your community. And it was kind of this light bulb moment for me, the realization that shame works well when you're wielding it against somebody who's on your team, right? Somebody who has accepted, you share these, same values. But it seems to have the opposite effect when you try to wield it across an ideological divide. Because if you already see the other side as evil, then the fact that they hate you is in general, not just because the Bible says so, but because you think that they're wrong. So the fact that they think you're wrong, it's like, well, this again becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's part of it. Another part of it, though, is that, when people would be, saying horrible things to us, of course, I know our good intentions. I know the fact that, my family, that they're not stupid. They're not hillbillies. Like all the kind of like, and they're not evil, right? I see all of the good parts of them. So when people are aiming all of these arrows at us, they never landed because it was so far from my understanding of who we were and what we were about that do you know what I mean? Like if you are very, very, I don't know, if you're smart or if you're beautiful and somebody calls you ugly, like you just like, okay, whatever. Sure. Like, I'm just saying, like your sense of yourself, like if you have a strong sense of yourself, when people make these like wild accusations, they don't land.
Yeah.
And it didn't land.
Well, and you were being portrayed as a caricature and not really as a human being in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I had a friend, shortly after I left say, like, Westboro is responsible for their own PR, right? Like, we gave this impression. We were almost not even just, it wasn't ignorance, and it was deliberate, right? This image that we cultivated of the, like, we don't care what you think. We are going to say the most extreme things in the most provocative ways to get attention because we think that this is the most important thing in the world. But like, and in cultivating that image, of course, people are responding in these, like, they are provoked by our provocation. And so I totally understand where that comes from. Like, and I'm not saying I like blame people for taking that approach. What I am saying though is that it's not effective for people who are, the way that I was.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated because we came from similar backgrounds in the sense we came from monolithic faiths. Where do you think that certainty comes from? Not just in the religious context, but you left a life of certainty and a community that was certain. Where do you think that feeling of certainty comes from, and how can we identify it in our own lives and the lives of others?
I mean, I think there's a certain amount of it that's just part of the human condition, right? Because we are each, individuals. We have a lifetime of experience that leads us to our positions. And we were just talking about this earlier with David Foster Wallace, right? We are at the center of our experience.
Right.
And it can be very hard, even though we know intellectually that there is a massive amount of other experience in the world, other viewpoints in the world. It can be very hard in the day-to-day to remember that and to kind of, step outside of your own perspective. And of course, because our perspective is so immediate. So there's part of it that I think is just baked in. But other parts of it are like, it's just a very appealing place to be, to feel like, what you're supposed to do with your life. I mean, it was one of the hardest things when I left, suddenly having to make decisions about not just, like big questions, like where to live and what kind of work to do and all this, but just like the minutia of like how I should structure my day, because for so long, my family had been the ones deciding this. Like, it had been decided by my circumstances and by the people around me, and having to make those decisions, like, it's exhausting, partly, first of all.
Right.
And it's also just, there's so much, I think for people who, when you hit the point where you graduate and you are trying to figure out how to structure your life, I think a lot of people had that same experience, right? So there's just something really wonderful about, like, it's not obvious sometimes, like when you are in that position of of deep certainty, what the problem is with it, because it can feel so good.
Yeah, we want a natural sense of knowing that I've got things figured out.
Yeah,
it's anti-fear, right?
It is, and it's just comforting. Like, it just frees you from so many of those decisions and the hard questions.
Yeah. I want to circle back to Twitter, especially because we talk a lot about social media as an evil. We talk a lot about algorithms and the fear of losing privacy and not having productive conversations. Why do you think it was Twitter? Why do you think social media particularly? Because you mentioned intimacy, but in a kind of, there was still space between you and the other person. Talk to us about that.
So, part of the reason, sorry, I'm not trying to like avoid the question, like,
Sure.
So for witch trials, right? Like, when I wrote the letter to J.K. Rowling, one of the things, several of the things that I talked about were what I worry that social media is doing to us. And it's all the things that I think we are, like you said, it's also amplifying some of our worst impulses, incentivizing extremes, because that's what gets engagement. Whether, if somebody's agreeing with you, taking this like very strong position, or, screaming at you for taking it. And then also just the flattening of and loss of context. I talked about how, we're each coming into all these interactions with our own experience, and we're seeing other people's thoughts in our own context rather than in their context, and the people that we don't know, whose lives we don't know. And so there's obviously all of those negatives. But I think part of what made it so powerful for me is, first of all, again, just exposure to people in a way that I never had it before. I never felt safe. Like, when I'm having those conversations, I'm like lying in bed. I'm sitting in my own house, at my desk. There was a sense of safety. And then again, that rapport. One of the things, people talk about how, because you often see like the most extreme like versions of people's positions on social media, or like they're again, it's certainty, it's the loudness, it's wow, I totally lost my train of thought there.
That's all right. That you feel that you're surrounded by people all the time who are certain of their own beliefs.
Yeah, and you don't want to but I was used to that. That's where I was going.
Right.
I was used to that. I was used to the yelling and the screaming and, people trying to, but I think for most other people, like, it is a thing that tends to shut people down and make them afraid to weigh in.
Mm-hmm.
So what ends up happening is, like, the people with the strongest positions are the ones who decide to weigh in.
Interesting.
And like there's this kind of this self-censoring, maybe, I don't know if majority is the right word, but a lot of people who just don't, because it's not worth that, getting into that kind of conflict on the internet.
Yeah.
And so again, this is part of the like amplifying extremes. It's kind of the other side of that coin.
Well, it strikes me that the two extremes, the extreme groups catering to that need for reaction, and the moderates, those who have not yet formed an opinion or are afraid to form an opinion, it's a chilling effect.
Chilling effect.
Feeling as though they're not being able to participate.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think chilling effect is probably a better term for it, rather than like, because it's not necessarily a silencing thing. It is, and there's one other element, of course, which is the Twitter mob, right? Which is one of the things that we're talking about on witch trials, is like how it's not to say that that the impulse or the feeling of like being upset or even outraged at somebody else's opinion, it is the effect on the discourse when you end up with kind of these a massive number of people, like the dog pile effect.
Yeah.
And how it causes people to self-censor.
Well, you brought it up, so let's talk about the podcast. Why did you agree or decide to do the podcast? What's the historical context for this? Why do this?
So just over 2 years ago now, I got a call from my friend Andy Mills, who is like me, a former religious fundamentalist. And we had, been friends for many years at that point. And he, in this conversation, we're talking about how, like, it's kind of interesting that J.K. Rowling has been the subject of these two backlashes, one from the Christian right in the late 90s, early 2000s, and one now from largely on the left. And it was, at first was kind of this just, curiosity, and we started to investigate, and, the longer we looked into it, the more we realized this is extremely complex. There are a lot of issues related. We thought, oh my gosh, we definitely need to, like, if we do something with this, we definitely need to change the title of this podcast, because it sounds like we are being flippant about, to try to say that, like, that these are to draw like exact parallels between these two things,
right,
which they're not exact parallels at all. And then again, as we continued looking into it, we realized, like, people on all sides of this use this language of witch hunts and, like, seeing the other side as being in a moral panic. And so it became this question, like, what are these people seeing not these, when I say these people, everyone involved, what are they seeing and what are they responding to that makes them draw those parallels? And then it really is trying to get at this much bigger question of discernment. So when I left Westboro, I thought, how can I ever trust my mind again? That was how it, like, because if I was so certain, And I had all the evidence. It was all laid out right there, chapter and verse. And I had spent all these years memorizing it. And I knew that I was well-intentioned. I knew that my family was well-intentioned. How did we get to this place?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's a question I've had since I left, and I've, come up with these, questions that I ask myself, but we wanted to look into it in a more, like formal way, I guess, and not just in my own context. And so, yeah, I get it. We get into this at the end. It'll be in episode 7, like really trying to understand, how do we know? Because I think there's a lot there.
You've already got pushback, and you've had some support as well in the media. It's caused a significant amount of dialogue. But how have you addressed, or how do you respond to the critics who say, why are we even doing this? Why are we even having this conversation? Because there are many. The Washington Post just ran a story, I think 2 days ago, something to that effect. So how do you respond to that we should just not even touch this?
So I completely understand. And at the very beginning, as strong as my belief in, public open dialogue, as strong as my belief in that is, just because of how it totally and completely remade my life, I would never have pursued this project if it was only based on my belief. Because again, I'm coming from a place where I, with all good intention, did a lot of damage to a lot of people. And so I spent a lot of time talking with people, including many trans people. And I realized pretty quickly, I mean, it's that, that self-silencing, people who are afraid to speak up because they see what happens to people who speak up. So the shorter answer to your question is after many conversations with a lot of people, realized like people do not want to continue for things to continue as they have. Like it is the nature of this particular conversation, about sex and gender. It is the temperature is so high. The stakes feel so high for people on all sides. And so it makes it very difficult to have a conversation. And so it is because of all those conversations I had at the beginning that I thought, okay, it's worth the risk, I understand that there are people who do not want to hear it. And I would never, of course, try to force that on anyone. I would never try to force anyone to have a conversation that they're not prepared for. But my deep sense after many conversations was that people wanted to be able to talk about the issues at the heart of this, because again, the stakes are very high, and I think by trying to conversation is the way forward. In the absence of conversation, good faith conversation and engagement, we are left with force and violence. And so some of it, is manifest in actual violence, in public, at protests and things. But the force element, it's also, this is partly what I think what we're seeing in the plethora of laws being passed across the country. Like if we can't have a conversation, you end up with a very blunt instrument of the law to try to deal with this. And so it's like people are using whatever power they have to try to force the other side into submission. And I don't think that's been productive. And more than anything, I hope that, this podcast is like, it's not going to be, the issues are not going to be solved with a podcast. Right. But what I really hope comes through is that like this attempt at perspective taking of really helping people understand. Sorry, this is my daughter's dinner alarm.
I hope she's feeding somewhere.
Right, yeah, somewhere. But it is trying to help people recognize where the other side is coming from. Because while there are, I think, people who truly are Like they do not think trans people should exist, that they shouldn't be seen in public, that this should not be something that we accept. There are people like that,
Sure.
but there are many people.
Someone else is hungry.
Somebody else is like, but yeah, I mean, like it is, people really want to have the conversation is what yeah.
So, and do you think that cuts both ways too, where there are, I know, having done some basic Googling on this, there are those that are seeing this podcast as now, well, this is a vindication of the anti-trans, the TERFs, et cetera, and hooray for Megan Phelps for finally, allowing this position to be given. Do you think that cuts both ways, that it's not just those that are opponents, but also supporters who need to hear the nuance of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so I was actually just texting with a friend of mine who is a transgender person, and he was saying, he was saying in listening to those early episodes, like how even just understanding what shaped Rowling's views, how immediately so many of the things that she said both make more sense and help him recognize that she is not coming from a place of just simple bigotry, like that she's trying to harm trans. She just doesn't like trans people and things. And so I don't think that understanding somebody's position or like that it just immediately does away with any harm that they've done. But I do think there is power in understanding where somebody's coming from, both in that it can help ameliorate that pain, and then also to show you where they're coming from so you can build a bridge, right? Yeah. Like if it goes back to what we were saying earlier about like when somebody's making these, criticisms of you, but if they're not connecting with anything that you recognize as real and valid, it just kind of washes over you. Like if you want to to be able to connect with someone, you have to understand where they're actually coming from.
Yeah, meet them on their human level instead of this image that you've conjured.
Mm-hmm. And also, I would say that the people who think that it's just a simple defense of J.K. Rowling will be really surprised when they hear the later episodes, because like we do go into all of those questions and challenges that and objections that people have had to her position. So in over the course of the podcast, like you are getting Rowling's perspective. In episode 2, when we talk about those Christians who really objected to her books, we didn't shame or blame them. We didn't say, oh, look at these crazy people. Like we went back to like the context of like what was happening in the 90s. What were they responding to? Yeah. And so while we do that with Rowling and with the Christians, we also do it with trans people.
Interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how it wraps up. This is, after all, a constitutional law funded thing, so we should at least mention Snyder v. Phelps. So it's a majority decision, overwhelming majority decision. It's a landmark free speech case, and Eric gave us a good intro into it. These many years later now, having separated yourself from the faith and the position you are in with your family, where do you stand on that case? Do you think it was decided rightly?
I do think it was decided rightly, which isn't to say that I think funeral protests are good or that people should do it. I think that the law in this country is not the instrument that we should use to try to stop people from doing that. I think we should be using moral suasion, right? Like trying to persuade people the way that, as I've done since I left Westboro. The facts of that case are actually, I can't tell you, we protested so many funerals, hundreds. And when we found out that somebody was filing this lawsuit, we immediately went and started looking at the facts of that case. And like, if you do that, what you find is that like the set of facts in that particular protest could not have been more strongly, in our favor. So the reason I think that it was decided rightly is because, again, all of those things, like the church members were more than 1,000 feet away from the church where the funeral was held. Mm-hmm. The funeral procession, they didn't see the church members. They didn't see the signs, the people who going to the funeral, unless they went a completely different, like went out of their way to see them, basically. The police had put them in this area, like in a small area in this orange snow fencing. And essentially, like if the judgment against the church, the original judgment at the trial court level, had been allowed to stand, I should say also there were other people out there with signs much closer, like up by the church. It was just that the message was different, right? Their message was, God bless America, God bless this family. In this country, like obviously there's a very strong precedent. Like we cannot stop people from saying things that we don't like. Like, I mean, like, to put it in a very kind of brute way, maybe, inelegant, but it is like the importance of free speech and the ability to talk about matters of public interest in public is essential to the functioning of a pluralistic society. And while that does mean that a lot of bad ideas are have the ability to be spoken and to be out there, I actually think that is a good thing. It is a good thing to be able to, in public, debate those bad ideas so that people don't just essentially go on believing them, right? We have to have, I think, a culture where we can talk about these things. And because, as we're talking about earlier, right, it is, people come to bad ideas in many different ways. And I think there is a kind of a utopian impulse to think we can just, if we could just shut down all the bad ideas, then everything would be fine. When it's just, again, people come to bad ideas from books. They reason themselves into bad ideas. They are, like me, taught by their families, learn from their friends. And the answer isn't to try to stop people from saying them. It is, when you encounter them, to be able to have the words, the language, the arguments, right? To talk through them and to explain, why have we chosen a different way? Like, what is wrong and destructive about these ideas? What happens if you follow these ideas to their logical conclusions? How this hurts the world, how this hurts people.
Yeah. One thing that's always interested me about that case is not only was free speech at issue, but lurking behind it was the religious aspect as well, because it was not just, your family was not just giving a political statement, but they saw it as a expression of their religious beliefs. What do we do when we have those combined together? Do you think that changes anything? Do you think that part of that was what was fueling so much of the division in the case? What do you think?
I mean, for us, the speaking, like, there was no separation between, it was an essential part of our religion that we go and speak it, right? Like to share because like we saw, loving our neighbor, right? It was going and warning them. So the act of warning them that if you continue down this path, you will go to hell. There are these consequences for, curses from God in this life and hell in the next. And like that was, again, we saw that as the fulfillment of our duty to God and to our fellow man. And so to say, okay, well, you can have freedom of religion, but when it comes to speaking in public, like, we should try to, it would be an essential, like it would, the abridgment of our free speech would be an abridgment of our freedom of religion as well.
Possible to divorce the two.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we open it up to questions, now that you have where you are in your life, you have a wonderful husband, you have children, you're a loving mother, an activist, a podcaster, a writer. What would you tell us, all in this room, as to what we can do to emulate a life of treating others with that kind of grace that you talked about? Raising your children, working in communities, interacting with other people. What can we do? What insights can you give us into treating others with that kind of respect?
I think, well, first of all, like I coming from a place where I tried to tell other people how to live, I'm really hesitant to do that again. But I would say that I just think, the epigraph of my book is this line from The Great Gatsby that still I talk about too much, but it's because I love it. It says, reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. And to me, there is so much wrapped up in that. It is the concept of grace. It is the willingness to see other people as being on a journey, right? It's like, so it's the reserving judgment aspect, right? It's very easy in a moment when you see somebody behaving in a way that you think is wrong or destructive and think, oh, this is who this person is. And not recognizing, I think, that if we think about our own journeys, we are not who we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, we look back at who we were and the things that we said and did very often, I think, and are embarrassed. Like, oh, I can't believe I thought that. I can't believe I, believed that, or I acted in that way, or I treated that person this way. And I think it's good and healthy, right? We recognize, our own evolution. And I think the willingness to see that other people too are on a journey, and that in giving them grace, it isn't just like saying, okay, what you're doing is good and fine and okay, and you should continue doing it. It is to make space for them to change, which is what you want, right? It's the tendency to try to wield punishment as a way of like forcing someone to change. It's just not, in general, I think, as effective as a more positive, like, again, making space for them to change, like trying to give them more information, things that can help them recognize that there is a different way. I just think that it's in general, like, that how we respond, right? Like, do you respond best when somebody's trying to like force you or punish you? In general, I think we tend to respond better to, again, those more, positive incidents, like the way that people address me on Twitter.
Yeah.
And it's just a human thing. And it can be very, very hard to do, especially when you vehemently disagree with somebody.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, again, that it is incumbent upon everybody to, in every moment, do the thing that I know it's hard. But I do think that the more of us who are willing and able to engage in that way, I think that's a far more likely to change hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Well, I want to open it up to questions. And I believe we have Phil and Eric are working the mics right now. So feel free to raise your hand. I will be the one calling on questions. And if you have access to a microphone, we'd love to hear from you. So why don't we start with Sam up here at the front?
Hello.
We got you. We can hear you.
So despite all of the changes that you've gone through, and the journey that you've been on, do you still receive sort of unrequited hate from some people who just do not care, do not think that your journey is worth anything, and still hold your past against you, despite the fact that you didn't really have a choice in that past?
Occasionally, like, it's actually been quite rare. And I expected it. I expected everybody to be that way when I left Westboro. I did not expect forgiveness. I did not expect grace. I did not think that I would ever be able to escape, what I did. And from the very beginning, it was a really shocking thing for me that the vast majority of people that I've encountered have been willing, like, have, again, recognized that I was a child raised in this environment that made all of those conclusions seem inevitable to me. And I should say too, like, I don't take it for granted even now, like I recognize that, I still meet people that I protested, way back when. And obviously, like, the more years there are between my life at Westboro and now, the stranger it is, and the kind of almost the harder it is to talk about, because it's like, yeah, it's a very strange experience, because there is such a split, and it's such a deep split, and it can be so often when I when I talk to people about this, I usually start with like this 5-minute video of me basically like yelling at people on the picket line. And it's such a strange thing to watch because like I remember being that person and I remember engaging in this behavior and I don't believe those things anymore. And it's like being forced to say something that I don't actually believe. And so it's all a very strange experience, but I'm very grateful for the people who, because I wouldn't, so much of the work that Adam mentioned that I've done since I left, the work with schools, the work with law enforcement, the counterterrorism, like all that stuff is like, I would never have, I'm grateful to be able to use those experiences to do good in the world is what I'm saying, like to find a way to kind of redeem those experiences. And I would not have been able to do that if people hadn't shown me an enormous amount of grace.
Matt, I think you had a question, and then over here after Matt's finished.
Well, thank you very much for coming here, first of all. I was just wondering, you've spoken here tonight, and you've spoken in the past of these real key watershed moments for you being these Twitter interactions you've had where real key aspects of Westboro's tenets and ideology was challenged and these contradictions were posited in front of you. I was just curious, do you feel that those interactions you had were really the beginning of the sort of cracks in your worldview starting, or were there moments before that of skepticism and doubt and those Twitter interactions kind of was like the momentum bringing it forward?
So there were a few moments that I only really recognized in hindsight. So, I mean, I can give you a couple of examples, but in those instances, so I'll give you one example. So when I was like 16, I was in high school and I had written a letter to the editor, and one of my aunts completely rewrote it. It was because it was opposing a letter that had been written by one of my classmates who had started a Gay Straight Alliance at our school. And in the letter that my aunt rewrote, she said, my grandfather's preaching is more agreeable to my heart than the words of these outsiders. And I immediately, like, I bristled. I just felt almost disgusted is not really too strong of a word. And it wasn't until I was in those few months before I left Westboro, until the moment I truly considered for the first time in my life that we were wrong. That was one of the first things that I realized that my mind kind of went back to, was that moment, because I realized that was one of the contradictions. My mom would quote this passage about how the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, and who can know it? And so it was that, like, the idea that you could not rely on your heart, right? Because you could only rely on the judgments of the elders. You know, this is what the Bible says. And the realization, like, there's a contradiction here, right? Because to say that, you know, we have an unction on our heart, like our heart, like that's what's giving us the sense that the Bible is the literal infallible word of God in the first place. So ultimately, at the bottom of everything, you are making a judgment. And that contradiction, like, was apparent. Like, my mind had, like, it had caused me to bristle but I just, like, immediately swallowed it and looked away. But again, like, there's a few moments like that. And so I think in most of them, the tendency was to swallow it, right? To, like, have it in this, like, tiny box in the corner of my mind and bury it. In one instance, like in at least one instance, it was the other response to those doubts was to assume that because I had this thought and this feeling against the church's judgment, that there was something wrong with me and not the judgment and not the church. So it's ascribing the problem to yourself instead of to the ideology. So to answer your question, long story short, the Twitter for me, it was the first explicit contradiction that the church could not answer. That was the thread that unraveled everything. Because again, it was the knowledge that we were human and fallible and that our judgment was not unquestionable. Like understanding that really intuitively was the beginning of the end for me.
I think we had a question right here, and then let's tee up another one. Quinlan?
So I've seen a few people, friends of mine, leave fundamentalist groups and then wind up like months or years later in a different like high control group. I think partly thanks to the conditioning. What would you say to those people? How do you help them get out of that?
I think that situation you describe I think it is really common. And this is going to sound maybe dumb, but when I realized that the impulse was still there, the fundamentalist impulse was still there, thanks to diet culture. Like I learned about the Whole30, and I had a really great experience, and I realized like the fundamentalist evangelical, like I wanted, and it took me maybe a few months to realize like I'm now demonizing food instead of sins, and I'm trying to like. And it was really interesting. I'm sorry, it's a dumb example for me, but like I have had the same experience where I've seen people leave, fundamentalist groups and end up doing the same thing with a different ideology. And I would say, again, the impulse is totally understandable. It is the most comfortable place to be. This kind of like very black and white certainty. But I mean, to answer your question, I think it's so individual though. Like, it's so individual in each case. Like, what is the need that is being answered for a particular person by this ideology? And so, I in my TED talk, I talk about these, 4 things that made real conversation possible. And for me, like it was the things that people on Twitter did for me. Asking questions, assuming good intent, staying calm, and then making the argument ultimately. It's not something that I think, it's not as simple. It is simple, but it's not easy to do that in every situation. But to me, that's the best process I've been able to come up with.
Had to do Whole30 once. Emily wanted us to do it. And
It's amazing.
I'll never eat coconut oil again. Quinlan.
So before I came here, I watched your TED talk, and one thing that I kind of picked up on that you lightly touched on was the power of listening to the other side and how beneficial and necessary that can be on both sides. And it reminded me of a few years back, I read about a Black jazz musician, Daryl Davis, who was able to get Klan members to kind of hang up the robe after years in the Klan, just by being able to actually listen. And it makes me kind of think that your experience with Twitter is a total anomaly. I mean, a lot of times what we see with social media is people kind of pushing themselves into these tighter and tighter echo chambers where their own ideas are all they hear. That's consistently reflected. And maybe this is kind of a pessimistic view, but I feel like it's almost an inherent thing that some people have, being able to listen, being able to have their perspective changed. You being an example of someone who would be able to have their perspective change. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of people who, had they been in your position, would have just kind of dug their heels in deeper and fought harder against whatever they were hearing. So I'm wondering if you believe that you or other people are inherently different, and if not, how can people use social media to have their minds expanded rather than constricted, so to speak?
Great question.
Yeah. So, I mean, I started at the very beginning saying that I think it is a very natural thing over time to change your mind. Like, you are introduced to new information and experiences that that cause you to change your mind, that provoke you, right, to change your mind, that compel you. And so I don't think it's actually that strange. And even I mentioned Daryl Davis earlier, and earlier today, I mean, and it was more than 200 people, right? I don't think it's actually, and sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but another person, Derek Black, who was raised as a white nationalist, like very, from a very, like David Duke was his godfather, like very much in the community, very much a real hardcore believer from a very, very young age. And, he eventually left because of conversations that he had with Jewish people. A Jewish person invited him to Shabbat and started these conversations. And I guess part of what I'm saying here is, like, people do change their minds all the time. It's just, and the way that Derek put it to me once was that he said, change your community, change your mind. And this is why I think too, the impulse to shun and shame people is totally understandable. Like when they're saying and doing things that you think are horrible, but it's very powerful to, instead of shaming and pushing them away, and it's counterintuitive to do this, but to invite them in, right? To try to, like, again, show them another way, show them the experiences and things that counter their beliefs. And it's not, so I don't think I said this explicitly earlier, that to me, there were two things that happened to me on Twitter. There was the argument, and they were both essential. There was the argument, the explicit, like, connecting of, reason, right? These logical points. That was essential, especially coming from the background that I come from, this, like, very legalistic, arguing about everything, having all this evidence, like, that's making the argument was essential. But the emotional part of it was important too, because I came to respect these people. I came to care about what their opinions were. So at the beginning, when I was celebrating death and tragedy, but I'm on Twitter and I'm seeing, like, the way that, people responded when a celebrity, like when Amy Winehouse, I remember her specifically as one of these people, like, and watching people in these, like, very emotional ways, like people who had been really touched by her in some way, mourning for her. And, like, I had come to care about the opinions of some of these people. And so it meant something to me in a way that it just hadn't before. So I think both of those are important, the emotional part and the logical part. But to answer your question too, like, how we get to choose how we engage on social media. So while there are absolutely all kinds of, I think, bad incentives on social media and things like, again, the flattening of context and, like, but we also have the chance to recognize these things and to make different choices. And do I think that, and think and wish and hope that we can, build better incentives, like bake that into the platforms in a better way? Absolutely. But even in the absence of that, we can choose to engage differently. And so one of the ways, like, I try to be very, to not build the echo chamber, right? So we are curating our feeds, right? We can, follow people. Like, I deliberately follow people whose arguments sometimes, like, drive me bananas. But, like, I want to know what they think. I want to know what they're seeing. I want to see, and it's like, you can avoid the groupthink and the confirmation bias by choosing to follow people who have a different view of the world and who challenge your way of thinking.
Grayson, I think I saw your hand, and then I want to tee up another one. So anyone back? Yeah, back there with dark blouse and glasses. Yeah. Grayson, and then yeah. Gonna give Eric a workout tonight.
So you talked a lot about the contemporary issue of, I think, transgender rights and that whole discussion going on in America right now. I totally agree with the message, and I think it is the most effective way from, like, a utility point of view, reaching across to, like, a religious fundamentalist side and engaging with them genuinely and openly with, I know you brought up 4 points in your TED talk that I watched of how to have like a conversation like that. On the flip side though, when we have laws in certain states that maybe are restricting the rights of transgender individuals, let's say, when you kind of brought up Michael Knowles, it was at CPAC, who recently said, we want to eradicate all elements of transgender display from public life. How do you get your message across of engaging with the other side, say to a trans person? How do you sell them on the message of, we should be engaging with these people who have these very disparate, arguably bigoted beliefs, when they are actively trying to push policy to essentially erase or curtail fundamental rights from transgender people? How do you convince them otherwise if they say, oh, to hell with it, these people want to essentially remove me from public life? I'm perfectly justified in turning to violence or not engaging with them genuinely.
Great question.
Yeah, again, I completely understand, like, and I've said several times here, like, I would never say that you have to engage, right? Like, it's not for me, it's much more about the practical nature of what it means to change hearts and minds. And so, and I know that it can be extremely difficult, and especially for the people themselves who are being targeted. And so it is kind of a sad and frustrating thing about being human, so for instance, you mentioned Daryl Davis. It is a Black man challenging Klan members. It was a Jewish person, on Twitter for me. It was a Jewish person for Derek Black, white nationalist, and a person who went around holding a God hates Jews sign. Like, it is sad and frustrating that many of the most powerful people who, the power to change those hearts and minds are the people themselves, but also their allies, right? So it's not just the individuals themselves, but so it's frustrating that it's so powerful coming from the people who are maybe the most hurt. I think I just want to acknowledge that it's very frustrating. But again, from a very practical perspective, I remember having this conversation on Twitter once with somebody, and I was like, empathy is not agreeing. Listening it's not a betrayal of your cause. Like, these are the tools of effective persuasion. And again, while I also understand the impulse to use force and violence, part of the problem is that it becomes this feedback cycle where our willingness to use force and violence pushes the other side to also be willing to use force and violence. And the farther we go down that path, the harder it is to get to a place where you can actually change someone's mind. And so it's so much of the way that I think about this is just, it's just from that very practical perspective. And I will just acknowledge it sucks. It really sucks. But I also don't know a better way.
There's a question here, and then I want to tee up another one if we can. Ian, since we're right here, we just as well do you next.
I think you basically addressed the question that I was about to ask. I'm an openly trans woman. I work at this university. I'm in the mathematics department. I'm a PhD mathematician. And in my roles here at this university, I've received hate mail on a number of occasions, including death threats, and vile images that I couldn't possibly show to anyone, and the people I showed them to wept. Legislation continues to move forward in this country to ban medical transition, and it is medical transition that saved my life. I love who I am. I love my voice, and I love myself. My question, which you just asked, was, what advice do you have for me in my role to engage with people who I have come to perceive as my enemy? But I think you just answered it.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you said the very end of that about how do you engage with your enemy, like it is, it's one of the things that I think we at Westboro did really horribly. But I do think it's an extremely powerful idea. And it comes from Jesus. I'm not a Christian anymore, but I still, it's become a really powerful thing in my life, this idea of love your enemies. And again, it's from, as I was just saying, like, it is from a very practical perspective. It is because it is so powerful. It is unexpected, right? It is, it was one of the things that I expected, the hate. I did not expect the kindness. And I just want to say, like, I would never, not only would I never, like, I would never tell you, you must do this. I mean, I don't want to say that I completely understand your experience, but I empathize with you as a human being. Like, I have also received rape threats and death threats and all kinds of horrible things. Like, I know that it's really painful, and I'm really sorry that people have done that to you. And it's, I think maybe part of the analogy too is the way that gay people have found acceptance over the last, 30 years specifically, maybe. Like, it was people willing to come out and talk about their experience. Like, I am your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your friend. Like, we are gay and we are here and we are not dangerous and we are not after your children. We are human beings like you. We just love different people than you might expect us to. And I think just the fact of you living openly, proudly your life and showing people, like, that you are a good person and that you are not some, like, the way that, trans people were shown in media for a very long time. Like, you are doing, just your existence, in other words, is part of that act of helping people learn and understand what it is to be a trans person. And so, I mean, I don't want to say, like, you have to engage with those people, but I would say that even in the absence of that, you are already in many ways doing that work.
Ian, and then up here in front. Two questions. Okay, so we'll tee up two of you there too.
Hey, you already answered part of my question, but maybe you could expand on it a little more. This morning in Dr. Kuhn's class on political thought, you mentioned or talked about the difficulties of how you had to let go of some things and what you wanted to hold on to when you were leaving Westboro. And the biggest part of that being Christianity. So I wanted to know where you're at in that journey, but you mentioned you're not a Christian anymore. I was going to ask if maybe you were a renewed Christian or if you denounced that faith entirely.
I wouldn't say denounced. It's just, I mean, one of the things about growing up at Westboro is that, again, we memorized a lot of things in the Bible, and some of them I still think are really beautiful, and I love them. There's this one passage that I really, like, glommed onto shortly before I left, and it's this passage that goes, by long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. I love that second part, especially, a soft tongue breaketh the bone. And, like, it is so much of what I'm talking about here, right? It is the power of that sweet reasonableness. That's one of the things that but anyway, like, so there are aspects of Christianity that and like the Bible that I really love and that still shape me, but it's not because it's in the Bible. It's just because there are all kinds of things in the Bible too that I think are, at least there are a few, I should say, there are a few things that I've never found a good explanation for. Many of the things that Westboro believes, like, I have spent a lot of time talking to Christians about, and realizing, like, oh my God, like, we could, again, it's the interpretation thing. There's totally different ways of viewing this, but there are some that I'm like, I've never found an explanation that is both consistent with the text and makes any kind of sense to me as something that I can recognize as good. So if anybody has an answer for Romans 9, I'm ready. But yeah, it's like, I would say, like, I've said this to Adam too many times, but I love people and I want people to thrive. Like, I remember hearing John Ronson say that he believes in human beings more than ideology. and the effect that our behavior and our, that it has on human beings. Like it, to me, is like it's very humanistic. And my family used to look at humanism and use humanistic as a way of like denigrating an experience, like that it's not godly, right? And to me, like that is now the thing that I lean into more than anything. It's like, is this good for people? Like, what is the effect of this on people? And laying waste to people in pursuit of or in defense of an ideology. To me, like that's one of the, a conflict like that. I just, the human will always win, which is a very maybe.
Well,
like,
you used an analogy with regard to faith of pulling the thread, right?
Mhm.
And it's hard once you've started to pull the thread on one faith and on your faith to weave it back into some other new tapestry. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, and so, yeah, you're right. Because like, even this is something that came up when we were talking about becoming parents, and how hard it is. Like, so when you reject the way, that you were raised, like many of the aspects, like I'm not going to teach my daughter obey. Like I'm not going to tell her that the sum total of, the value of her life is whether she is obedient. Like I'm not going to do that. But the problem is if you don't create another kind of scaffolding, like you will do what you know. And so like that's been a huge thing for me for the past, my daughter is almost 4.5 now. And so I'm not going to beat her. What am I going to do?
Yeah.
Like how do I respond when she's having a hard time? Like what is and maybe other people don't. I think a lot of people have these questions.
Yeah.
It's not just people who have left
Sure.
these faiths, but like they're huge questions, and you have to have something in the alternative, or else you'll just go back to. What,
I think we have time for 2 more questions, and they're both up here at the front. So
Thanks for being here again. 2 quick things. One is, so positive exposure is something that I'm thinking of as a summary for so much I've heard. And I'm wondering if something like a positive exposure, thinking is a way for anyone who, let's say, just speaking to maybe a trans person, if they're willing and in that mode of being able to do it, I guess you have to kind of want to do this, I guess, in a way, right? You can't just throw yourself into it. But I think presenting kind of let's say approaching a person, wanting to give them a positive exposure. Like if you go into it with that thinking, it's not about the fight or the argue or the debate. It's about being human and giving that positive exposure, because, mentioning the Jews and, things like that. Again, they presented a positive exposure.
Yeah.
And I could think of that as even my own life experiences. And I'm just thinking of them and how they changed me because of positive exposures at a young age. So just wanted to put that out there as a thought.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
The other was just how is WBC doing today? Are they still as strong as, which I hate to think them as strong, but is that where are they still growing and thriving?
No, I mean, they're not growing. And I based on things that I've heard since I left, and since, I have cousins and siblings who have left after I left as well. And just in general, like you just don't hear as much about them anymore. And part of that is good in that, they have moderated in some ways, just the nature of some of their signs and, getting rid of, some of the more extreme ones, for instance, praying for children to die and for soldiers to die, things like that, which, this is, I always say, like, I understand this is a very low bar, to not pray for horrible things to happen to people. But it is a significant change. So like those are, I think those are good. One of the things that makes me sad though, is that like a lot of the things, the tactics and the tones and things that made us infamous are now far more common. And so it's like, in some ways it feels like and I don't want to say everybody is Westboro now, but there is a lot more of that kind of like vitriol that is like very, very common. And it makes me, very sad. Like when I left, there was, I think, a major sense that like we were just this kind of anomaly, right? And realizing like we are human. The church is filled with humans, and in the same way that we were subject to all of these cognitive biases and things, like we all are. And so the question is like, what can we do to try to solve for these things, and again, to choose better ways of engaging, and which is partly why I spend so much time talking about this stuff.
So we are actually a member of a group that I started called the Humanist Association of Wisconsin. It's a secular group. So we do get a lot of people who've deconstructed, and most of us have been to church or grew up in church. And so most churches deliver messages of, damnation and punishment and warnings, but in a different kind of way. Westboro's famous for a reason. Do you still, now that you've been out of the church for a while, see that as coming from a place of love? And then also, I wanted to ask, just genuinely curious, it takes, two to be willing to have a dialogue. Do you see people from Westboro being willing to have an open dialogue?
So they're definitely far more cautious, like on social media, for instance. Because again, me talking so much about how social media changed me, like there's far less of the direct engagement with people on Twitter, platforms like that. But I will say, I didn't mention this a minute ago, but like part of the thing of like them moderating was in direct response to letters and things that I was sending them, like arguments that I'd made in public. I've heard from other people, again, more in my generation, who have left, who were persuaded by some of these arguments that I was making. And so I'm not trying to say anything except that even when it is just this one-sided thing, it can still be powerful. I send these letters to my family, and because again, I don't think that living by that total division that they believe is necessary, right? Like they see me as evil, like more evil than gay people or anybody else that they protest, or people who have left the church. And so because of that, like, again, they maintain this, very strong wall of separation. And I don't think people change that way. So all of this to say, though, that your choice to engage in good faith can be extremely powerful, even when the other person is has those walls built up. And most people do not have walls as strong as my family, or so I say. But yeah, I just think, yeah, engagement is it's so powerful, and it's like, so for instance, like for me on Twitter, the people who reached out to me, like I had no interest in changing my mind. Like I was dead set on and I had every incentive in the world to stay exactly where I was. And yet I could not help but like people who treated me with kindness and as a human, like I just naturally responded to that. Like it takes a lot of energy to maintain that kind of attitude to somebody who is treating you like really well, and like with that kind of kindness and compassion, and the humor, like all those things, like we just naturally respond to those things. And so even if it sometimes seems like you're wasting your time, like I think it's important to remember that people might not change their mind in a single moment, but you are still contributing to the experiences that could help them see differently.
One last question before we wrap up. It's a warm, fuzzy question. Your daughter is 4. Part of your story is about generations, your grandfather, 2 parents to you. What do you hope by the time your daughter is where you are changes in the world? What would you like to see different?
One of my, I talk about this quote from one of my favorite writers, Marilyn Robinson. She talked about how the language of public life has lost the character of generosity. And I would love to have that back. I feel like when I was on Twitter, like I think so much has changed, you know, in the last 10 years, 12 years. And it makes me very sad to see that loss of generosity and grace. Like I remember what the internet was like. I remember what Twitter was like before it became what it is now.
Sure.
And I know that something very valuable has been lost. And I would love to find a way, I think, both for us as individuals to choose that, but also like what systemic things we can do. Like how can we change the platforms? How can we change the systems to make that the more natural response? How can we get that back? Like I would love to have that back.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. We appreciate all your thoughts tonight. Please give Megan a round of applause.